Hey everyone, I'm just going to talk about J. Frank Norris. If you haven't read the article yet, that's okay. I'll try to provide a little summary, but J. Frank Norris was a Baptist Democrat and a fundamentalist Republican. And you say, how does that compute? How does that add up? Well, apparently in 1928, there was a Catholic Democrat that was running. And in Texas, you were it was hard pressed to find someone that was not against Catholics, and so he was in that mix, and he went against Al Smith, and he 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 campaigned for Herbert Hoover, and then later when the New Deal came around, um, that was not popular in the South, and so he was he was against Franklin Roosevelt, so he went for Alf Landon and Wendell Willkie, the two opponents to FDR in 1936 and 1940. And then in 1944, J. Frank Norris supported Thomas Dewey, who was the Republican candidate, and um, and then he supported Eisenhower whenever whenever Truman was uh, whenever Truman was had left or whenever he supported Eisenhower against Adlai Stevenson. But anyways, to just talk about J. Frank Norris real quick. Um, he was he's a fundamentalist, and he was against the modern. Um, he he fought against modernism, and I found this a couple stories on online that show how he was against modernism, and how he was also um, trying to stop the division against, or stop the prejudice against Jewish people. Um, he wrote a letter to the rabbi of the Fort Worth Jewish Monitor, inviting him to use the auditorium on one Sunday night, and also explaining why he doesn't take part in trying to convert Jews for Christianity. He says, "I have my own views on this question, and they are at wide variance with most Christian ministers." The newspaper then writes, "We commend and heartily appreciate the spirit of Dr. Norris, and wish that every minister would display the same tolerance and the same fine Americanism that his letter shows him to possess. With men like him, there is no chance in this free land of ours for the serpent of race prejudice to thrive." And so he supported Jewish, Jewish, um, the Jewish people against prejudice from Christians. That letter that he wrote was in response to a sermon that had been given that by another pastor, and it basically said that the Jews were responsible for Jesus' death, and so the issue there was they didn't want this prejudice. They didn't want Jews. They didn't want pastors to keep on using that point about Jews and Jesus. But nonetheless, I found another article that talks about he went to San Antonio Baptist Tabernacle in the spring of 1924, and so they write in this article, Dr. Norris is probably best known by the work he has done in Texas and leading the fight for numerous reforms. One of these was on racetracks gambling in Texas in 1909, when Dr. Norris went to the legislator Austin and debated the issue before a joint session of both houses. He debated twice before the legislature to have the present Sunday law passed and put on the statute books. His talk before the legislature against evolution led the lower house to pass an anti-evolution bill 5-1. 2 years ago, he led the fight for a closer enforcement of prohibition laws for Texas, and at present he is leading the fight against evolution and modernism in all of its phases in the schools, both state and denominational. In a recent campaign against modernism in New York, the New York World editorially said concerning his address, "The address of Reverend J. Frank Norris last night reads like Demosthenes against Philip and Cicero against Catiline. He has been appointed representative of the World's Fundamental Convention to make a tour of the whole world against the ravages of modernism in all lands. His wife will join him in this trip, which will take 6 months to make. During the month of August, he has been invited to fill the pulpit of the famous Metropolitan Tabernacle Church, known as Spurgeon's Church, London. In his campaign in Europe, he will hold meetings at London, Edinburgh, Belfast, Paris, and various points in Germany, Russia, China, and Japan." So there you have it. It's showing how it's a world struggle that he's involved in, going across the world to fight modernism. And interesting that they compared him to Demosthenes against